In this video, we're going to be going over a new World PvE DPS build that's going to be all about applying bleeds to your targets. This build is incredibly fun and does a ton of damage. So for this build, we're going to be utilizing the sword and shield with the butcher artifact, and then we're going to be running a spear on our back bar. So for the sword and shield, we're going to be running reverse stab, whirling blade, and shield rush. Reverse stab is going to deal quite a lot of damage. We're going to upgrade it down to apply grit, and we're going to upgrade it fully in order to get the cooldown reduction that this gives you. We are then going to be upgrading whirling blade all the way down for the cooldown reduction and for the rend that it's going to apply. Whirling blade is a staple to this entire build because of the bleeds from the jagged whirl ability that you get from the butcher. We're also going to be utilizing shield rush. This is very nice because it's not only going to stagger and push back foes in the area, it's going to deal a little bit of damage. It has grit, and you are going to weaken all of the enemies in the area by 20% or within a 5-meter range by 20% for 10 seconds, and it's going to apply a slow. The slow is going to be very nice because that slow is going to be applied for 4 seconds. And that slow is quite nice because that's going to synergize really well with the opportunist passive that's going to allow us to deal 10% more damage to slowed foes. And then the passives we are taking are going to be very important to this build as well. So the final attack in your light attack chain is going to inflict another rend for 2 seconds. So you get 15% rend from the final attack in your light attack chain. And you also get 15% rend from your whirling blade, for a total of 30% rend. We're going to talk a little bit more about rend and weaken and debuffing the targets here in just a moment, but for now we're just going to go over these abilities. So we also have empowered stab. This is going to be a staple to the entire build. You're going to want to lead off with empowered stab every time you utilize the sword. This is going to grant you a 30% empower for 5 seconds, which is going to allow your bleeds to just deal a whole lot more damage. We're also going to be taking precision to increase our critical strike chance. That way we can proc our bleeds more often with the keenly jagged, and then we're going to be taking keenly empowered on our shield. So in order to help proc those things whenever we're not able to target the enemies from the back, we're going to be taking precision. We also have opportunist, as we mentioned earlier. This is just going to allow us to deal a little bit more damage to slowed foes. We're taking when your health is full, deal 15% more damage, which is very, very nice. And then we're going to be taking leadership, which is just going to increase the damage of ourself and our entire group by 10%. Then we come over here to the other side of the tree. We're going to get a little bit of mitigation with sturdy shield and with elemental resistance. And then we have the final blow. So the third attack in your light attack chain deals 15% more damage. We're not worried about causing more threat. We're just worried about that extra damage. So we have the 15% more damage here. And we also have the final attack causes a rend. And then we're taking recuperation, which is just going to allow us to stay alive a little bit easier because all incoming healing and regeneration is going to be increased by 10%. And then the spear abilities we're going to be taking is sweep. We're of course going to be upgrading this all the way to get the coup de grace passive so that we can proc bleeding sweep. We are taking perforate, upgrading it all the way, and we're taking skewer, but we are not going to take deep wound to increase the bleed duration to 15 seconds. That might sound a little bit weird for a bleed build, but I'll explain that here momentarily. So bleeding sweep is of course going to be utilized for some CC and then to apply an additional bleed. It's very important to point out here though that all of the increased bleed duration that you get from this build does not apply to bleeding sweep. I'm not sure if this is a bug or if it's intentional in the game, but bleeding sweep does not enhance its bleeds from perks like bloodletting on the ring or on the butcher itself or from the passive in the dexterity tree. Bleeding sweep does not increase the bleed duration. So just very important to point that one out there. We also have perforate here. So perforate is also going to apply another rend to your target as well as upgrading it fully to apply a weaken to the target as well. This may seem like a lot of rends and a lot of weakens, but we'll explain why here in just a second. We're also going to take skewer. This is going to give us an additional bleed for 20% weapon damage every 1 second for 10 seconds. We have the skewer deals 20% increased damage against targets that have full health. And then of course we're going to get an empower from the skewer if it crits. So all of those are going to allow us to do quite a lot of damage against our target, especially if it's at full health. And the reason we are not taking deep wound is because you can already have your bleed from skewer up indefinitely if you are running your rotation correctly. So whenever we get into the gear part here in just a minute, you'll see all of the items that's going to enhance the duration of our bleeds. And we're going to be able to tick skewer for a total of 17 ticks with this particular build versus 10 If you were to upgrade this all the way, you max your bleed ticks out at 20 ticks. So if you were to push this all the way up, even with all of the perks you have, theoretically, you would get about 23 ticks, but because it's capped at 20, you can't go any further than that. This ability has a 12.6 second cooldown, and along with a lot of the cooldown reduction you're going to get from this tree, you're going to be able to apply Skewer. It's going to deal 17 ticks, and then before those 17 ticks are up, you will be applying Skewer again. So this is really just a wasted passive because you're going to be able to apply Skewer indefinitely to your opponents anyway. And then as far as the passives go, we're just going to be taking critical chance increase by 10%. We really just take this node so that we can come down here and take sweep. We're going to be taking successful heavy attacks, reduce all spear cooldowns by 15%. We want a lot of cooldown reduction in the spear tree because this is where a lot of our utility is going to come from for our team. It's going to also help us increase our damage output, as well as help our survivability with the weakens that we're going to be applying with Enfeebling Skewer and with the Perforate skill. We have Invigorating Crits. We're going to restore 20 stamina on critical hits, which is very nice. And then we're going to be taking deal 25% increased damage against knockdown targets because, of course, we're going to be knocking down targets with our sweep ability. And then on the Impeller side of the tree, we are most definitely going to be taking Exacerbating Crits. This is going to extend the duration of our spear debuffs by 20%. So those Rends and those Weakens are going to get extended out even longer. We're also going to be taking Refreshing Jabs for the cooldown reduction, Finishing Blows in order to deal a little bit more damage. We're going to be taking the Aggressive Maneuvers. This is going to add even more cooldown reduction into this kit. And then we're also taking Exposed Wounds in order to increase our critical chance by 15% when we are attacking a bleeding target. And then we are going to be taking Exploited Weakness. We're just going to be able to deal 10% bonus damage for each debuff on your target for a maximum of 30%. So those are all of the abilities we're going to be taking for this particular build. And here shortly, we're going to go over how all of these synergize together and how best to stack your bleeds for this particular build. For now, we're going to move on over and talk about attributes and then jump into the gear section. And then at the end of the video, we'll talk about the rotation and how these bleeds work. So for this particular build, the 150 dexterity attribute threshold is very important. This is going to give you a plus 15 duration to damage over time effects, which is of course very strong for this particular bleed build. So for your attribute points, if you are just starting out, I'd recommend going 300 strength, 150 dex, and then 150 con for some additional survivability. This is just going to allow you to survive the expedition a little bit longer, especially if you're trying to run M2s or M3s. You obviously won't be pumping out near as much DPS at 150 con, but you will be able to survive and learn this build at that constitution level. If you become experienced at the build, and this is really the sweet spot where I'd recommend most players land, 350 strength, 150 dex, and 100 con. And then, of course, as you get even more experienced and become a little bit more advanced with the build, you can start to bump your con down a little bit more. So it'd be 350 to 150. And then if you begin to speed run with this build or get into a really cracked group, or if you just want to try your hand at the 5 con build, be 350, 250, and 5 constitution. So now let's take a look at all the gear we're going to be running for this build. We are, of course, going to be running the Butcher. This is the staple of the entire build. This sword has bloodletting on it, which allows your bleeds to last 33% longer, and this works on both weapons. This does work for your spear and your sword, just like it says here in the tooltip. However, bear in mind the ability that it doesn't work on, like we talked about earlier, is Bleeding Sweep. Bleeding Sweep does not enhance its bleed duration from any of these perks at all. And then the other perks that come on the sword is Jagged Whirls. So your Whirling Blade is now going to inflict a bleed, which deals 10% weapon damage for 6 seconds. Empowering Whirling Blade is going to give you 52% base damage whenever you land a Whirling Blade when there are 3 or more enemies within the radius of this ability. And then this sword also comes with Keenly Jagged, which is yet another bleed that we can stack. Inflicts a bleed on critical hit, dealing 10% weapon damage per second for 6 seconds. It does have a 7-second cooldown. And then I opted for now to put a Frozen Gambit into the sword. So I like to have an opal in my weapons whenever I'm DPSing. This just gives me direct control over how much damage I can do versus slotting a diamond in the weapon. However, bear in mind the opal is getting nerfed with Season 4. So another really good option instead of a gem slot would be something like Trenchant Rend. You are going to be heavy attacking a lot with your sword, so adding Trenchant Rend on here will just give you an additional rend, and this is going to be especially effective against bosses, which we'll talk about here in a second. And then you will be able to deal more damage to those targets. So just bear that in mind. With season 4, the opal is going to be getting nerfed some, so you may want to opt to put another perk on here even versus a gem slot. Now we'll take a look at the spears. So the spear that I have right now is Enfeebling Skewer, Shirking Lightning, Desperate Empower. Obviously not a great spear, but I run this spear strictly because it's a 700 gear score spear and it has Enfeebling Skewer on it. The spear that we're going to be shooting for this particular build is Enfeebling Skewer, Vicious, and Keenly Jagged. We're going to go over some additional spears you can get and some spears you can farm out here momentarily, because there are some other really good ones you could opt for instead of those specific perks. We'll talk about that here in just a second as well. And then for the gear, we're going to be running the light armor weight category, obviously as a DPS, and we're going to be doing this with the featherweight artifact as our chest piece. So what this means is we can now run a medium helmet. We're going to be running a light chest, but it is weightless, so it doesn't affect our armor loadout. We're going to be running light gloves, medium legs, medium boots, and a round shield. So we are able to incorporate some medium pieces and a round shield into this build because we have the featherweight artifact, which is going to increase our physical and elemental resistance by quite a lot with this artifact. I think it's roughly a 30% increase in your physical and elemental resistance whenever you're using this artifact, which is quite nice. And then as far as the perks, we're going to be running on our gear. For the helmet, we're going to be running the medium helmet with Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, and Health. The featherweight comes with Refreshing, Physical Aversion, and then a gem slot. And then for the upgrade at the Gypsum Kiln, we are going to be utilizing the health perk. Then for our gloves, we currently have Freedom, Elemental Aversion, Bleeding Sweep. I would ideally be shooting for Enchanted Ward, Health, and Bleeding Sweep on the gloves. However, you most definitely want to have Bleeding Sweep incorporated into this build. And then for the pants, we're going to be going with Refreshing, Health, and Shirking Energy. For the boots, we're going to be running Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, and Health. And then for the round shield, we're going to be going Keen Vicious, Shield Aggression, and Keenly Empowered. I have Refreshing on this shield because I've yet to get my shield. You obviously do not want to have 5 stacks of Refreshing like I do, because that is now a dead perk, but we'd be shooting for Keen Vicious, Keenly Empowered, and Shield Aggression on the round shield. And then for your jewelry, so we have Alchemist Reprieve, Flame Protection, and Divine for this particular amulet. For all of the amulets, you most definitely want your protection perk. That's going to be the most important perk for your amulet. You want the protection perk for whatever mutation you are running. The Bis amulet, in my opinion, would be Health, the protection perk, and then Empowered. And that's what I would be shooting for if I'm trying to shoot for Bis. However, these are amulets that I've been able to farm out, so those are the ones I'm using for the time being. And then for your ring, we're going to be running the Privateer's Heirloom. We'll talk about where to get this from here in just a moment, but we're going to be running Slash Damage, Hardy, and Bloodletting. This is very important. We did put Bloodletting on this ring because Bloodletting does in fact stack with the Bloodletting on the Butcher's Sword. This is going to allow you to extend your bleeds even longer. So the Bloodletting on the sword and Bloodletting on the ring, they do in fact stack. So that's why we were going Slash Damage, Hardy, Bloodletting. It is very nice and allows you to extend those bleeds for a few additional ticks. And then for the earring, we are currently running the Endless Thirst. This is fine if you don't have another earring, but I would recommend for the earring running just a normal earring with Strength or Dex on it, and running Refreshing Toast, Purifying Toast, Nimble, or Regenerated. But if you don't have one of those, the Endless Thirst works out just fine, and you can even opt to run this over the other earring if you wanted to. And then finally for the Heart Rune, we're going to be running the Brutal Heart Rune of Detonate. Detonate's just going to give you a passive increase to DPS without interrupting your DPS rotation. So you're going to take additional damage while this is charging. So be aware of that whenever you're activating this ability. So don't activate it at an inopportune time. But that is the Heart Rune that we're going to be opting for this build in order to increase our damage output. And as you're building this build out, be aware of how much Magnify you have added into your build, because this can cause your attribute point distribution to not be ideal, and you most definitely want to hit that 150 Dex attribute point bonus. However, with that in mind, there are several pieces of equipment for this build you can farm out if you choose to do so. So the Butcher and the Featherweight are obviously two of the artifacts we're going to be using. The Butcher comes from Zhao Taiying in the Mutated Dynasty Shipyard. The Featherweight comes from Nermur, which is a named enemy in the Elysian Wilds. Then you can also farm out a few other options for this build. There are some pants called hardy pants. So these are medium pants that come from the Eniad expedition, or you can craft them at a gypsum kiln for 3,500 dense materia, but they do have magnify on them, so be aware of that. Then the pirated spear of the brigand. Here's a few other options for spears that you can obtain. So the pirated spear of the brigand is rogue and enfeebling skewer, and then you can add an additional third perk to this spear. This comes from barnacles and black powder, but you have to run it at an M3 level. And then we have the life ring spear. This spear comes with vicious and keenly jagged on it, and then you could obviously add a third perk of enfeebling skewer. You can farm the life ring spear from the mob that spawns at the very top of the Tor Malak Tower in Eden Grove, or from the Torto Riven area within Eden Grove as well. There's also the syncratic spear you could use as an option. It comes with keenly jagged and trenchant rend. I think the other two spears are much better, but you could use this one if this is what you had. It comes from open world mobs and brimstone sands. And then finally, we have one other spear that I think would be great, and it is called the keratin spear. It is rogue and arboreal attunement, and it comes from brimstone sands. You can farm this out in Heliopolis or the Castrum Principium area. And then again, for all of those spears, you can obviously add a third perk to those at the gypsum kiln. Then we have the Privateer's Heirloom, the ring, which I am currently running in my build. This ring comes with hardy and slash damage on there. And then if you're running it with this build, you'll want to put bloodletting on there as well. Comes from Nereid and barnacles and black powder, or you can craft it at the gypsum kiln for 3,500 dense materia. Then we have the Azoth crystal gear. So this comes in all types of armor weights, and you can get this from mutation 2+ expeditions or at a gypsum kiln for 3,500 dense mutator materia. This gear does have enchanted ward and refreshing on it. However, it does come with magnify locked on there. So this would be a good option if you have a lot of dense mutator materia sitting around. You could roll these and get locked enchanted ward and refreshing, which are two of your best perks. And then you could hope to roll health as a third perk by using the gypsum kiln with the materia. It's a great way to get the build started, but again, it does have magnify. So just be aware of that so you don't put too much magnify into your build. And then as far as your gems go for your armor, you're going to want to slot the appropriate gem to mitigate the damage for that particular mutation. And then again, for your weapons, you can utilize either an opal or a diamond. If you're in a group with a good healer and you feel comfortable that your health is going to be topped off, then a diamond is a great option. But if you're running with a pickup group or a pug group, or if you're like me and you want more direct control of your damage, then an opal would be the ideal option for you. So now let's talk about the overall premise behind this build and your rotation and how you're going to deal maximum DPS with this build. It's obviously centered around applying a lot of pressure via bleed damage. So you're going to want to have bleed stacked as much as possible. You're also going to be utilizing the spear and the sword sum to debuff your targets with your rends and your weakens. So the reason we are opting to take perforate over cyclone in this particular build, you may be thinking this is overkill for your rends and your weakens, but bear in mind, whenever you are running M2s and M3s, whenever you're fighting those bosses, your rends and your weaken effectiveness is cut in half for M2s, and it's cut down by 75% in M3s. So whenever you land an enfeebling skewer with your spear, you are not doing 47% weaken to that boss. You're now only doing a 23.5% weaken in an M2 and like an 11% weaken or so in an M3. So whenever you have more weakens and more rends, it's just going to allow you to stack those a little bit better and hopefully reach those rend and weaken caps with yourself and your group. That way you can take down those bosses a whole lot easier. So that's why we're taking so much rend and weaken in this build. You're going to have a ton with enfeebling skewer. You have perforate that's also going to apply a weaken and a rend on your sword and shield tree. You have a 15% rend with your whirling blade. You also have a 15% rend with the final attack in your light attack chain. And we also have a weaken, a 20% weaken with the improved rush from your shield rush tree. So for your rotation, you're going to want to start out with enfeebling skewer. This is going to apply a very strong weaken to your target right out of the gate. And you are also going to deal additional damage to targets at full health with this ability. So you're going to enfeebling skewer. You're going to then do your perforate right into a bleeding sweep. Then you're going to switch over to your sword and shield. This part is very, very important. You want to make sure that you are heavy attacking your target, because whenever you heavy attack the target, you get that massive 30% in power. that 30% in power is going to increase the amount of bleed damage you do on your target. So for example, if we come back here and we backstab this dummy in order to land a crit to proc our Keenly Jagged, you will see that we are doing 286 ticks of bleed. If we start off with a heavy attack to proc the Empower, and then we come over here and proc a Keenly Jagged, we are now doing 364 ticks worth of bleed. So you can see the increased damage. So that is one of the reasons why you want to proc that heavy attack every time you start this sword rotation. So whenever you start your sword rotation, it is going to be a heavy attack immediately into a shield rush. The shield rush is again going to apply a weaken, and it's going to slow that target. And if you remember from the sword and shield tree, you also have opportunist, which is going to allow your abilities to deal 10% more damage to slowed foes. So after you shield rush, you're going to want to go into your whirling blade. So it's going to be, again, heavy attack immediately into shield rush, and then you whirling blade in order to deal that bleed damage. And if you have 3 or more foes around you, you will be empowered as well. And then after you do your whirling blade, you're going to want to go into reverse backstab for big damage and for the cooldown reduction that's going to apply to your other abilities. From there, you're just going to switch back over to spear and run right back through your rotation again. And then of course, if your abilities are on cooldown, you can start weaving in some light attacks with the sword, because with this finisher of the sword, you also get a rend with the last attack in your light attack chain. And then of course, you also get the 15% more damage from that third attack in your light attack chain as well. That's going to do it for this one, boys and girls. Thank you guys so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it. That is the Butcher PvE DPS build. This build does pump out a ton of damage, and I have been having an absolute blast playing it. So if you guys decide to try this out, or if you have already tried it out, let me know in the comments below what you think about this build. Hopefully this helps you guys out some if you're looking for a new build to run, or just looking for a good DPS build in New World. I would highly recommend this one. It is a ton of fun, provides a lot of value for your team, and does a ton of damage. But thank you guys again for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoy New World, enjoy New World content, please make sure to like and subscribe. I'd appreciate that as well. And of course, we stream every single Monday and every single Friday, 8 o'clock a.m. CST, right here on YouTube and over on twitch.tv/BDLG. Love to see you come hang out in the live streams. We have an absolute blast. That's going to do it. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next one.